Okay. All right, recording is beginning. Our training session is now live. And people are going to start trickling in. We have Richie here. And Steve Butkovic, who just signed in. All right, everybody's filing in here. So I'm going to give everybody an extra couple of minutes, and then we'll start off the festivities, if you will. All right, it's 2 o'clock. I'm going to give it a few more seconds just because we don't have many attendees yet. Okay. So again, this session is being recorded. The recording will be available at the end of the session. I will share that with you, Richard Gluns, and you can distribute it accordingly. All right, we have a lot of material here, so I'm going to just kind of kick it off. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for showing up today for our swimming pool webinar. My name is Joe Bignolis. I am a technical services representative here for LATICRETE International, and I want to take the time to thank you all for spending the time with us today. I know it's Friday afternoon and a whole hour of time can be hard to find, but I do appreciate you showing up on this very rainy and gloomy afternoon here in Connecticut. With me today is Art Mintie, my director. He's a man who really doesn't need much of an introduction here in the industry. He's been with LATICRETE for 25 plus years, and in the industry itself probably for a lot more than that. We just won't put a number to it. Art, how are you doing, sir?
Great, G.
Good
Nice to have you with us as well today, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have about an hour of time today to dedicate to this webinar. Art has a lot of material to share with us. He is also an expert in this field. I mean, he's an expert in tile field in general, but specifically swimming pools. So I'm really stoked to have him present this content to us today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. I will be monitoring this feature throughout the webinar and try to answer everybody's questions. If we have time at the end of the presentation, we will take some of these questions live. If for some reason we do run out of time and we don't get to your question, be assured we will reach out to you by email later on today. So without further ado, Art, if you don't mind sharing your screen and kick it off, sir.
All right, will do. Thank you, Gilles, for that kind introduction. I just want to acknowledge your efforts with our training team. You're doing a great job leading our training efforts. Thank you for organizing these events, for leading our team, and again, being an industry leader for educational content. So thank you for your efforts.
Thanks,
So
Art.
everyone, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us on a Friday afternoon. We know everyone is always busy with other things, but we appreciate you investing your time and trying to educate yourself on some very important features. So this is a topic that's very close to us here at LATICRETE. We love demanding applications. Now, these are the types of things that we really, really enjoy from a technical standpoint. We kind of geek out on these things. So swimming pools is one of the most difficult environments for ceramic tile finishes. So we hope to share our expertise with what we've learned over the years, and hopefully you can find this beneficial. So I do have a lot of content. I'm going to kind of go quickly through a lot of the slides to try to keep this within an hour. And again, if you have questions, you can use the features as Jill indicated. Okay, so here we go. So we're going to talk about different types of structures. We're going to talk about tile council installation methods, and then we're going to go through all of the components that make up a tile installation system within a swimming pool. So surface preparation, waterproofing, the finishes, installation materials, and then a little bit about protection and maintenance as well. So these are kind of the topics you'll see us go through. So what kind of pools does LATICRETE get involved in? All types. There is no type of pool that we have not put our hands on at some point around the world. So this is just going to be a quick little tour of some of the project types that we get involved with. So resort type swimming pools, these large recreational structures that are really magnificent in scope. We do Olympic competition pools. We've done several of these around the world. This one was for the Beijing Olympics. We do leisure recreational pools. These are excellent in cold climates. Sometimes I wish we had one right next to us here in Connecticut. And actually, you know, the presentation we're doing here is for a lot of our customers are in Canada. These are very popular there. So you might have seen these or actually been involved with some of these. Great recreational projects for the family. And when they're all clad in tile, we love that. Here's some high-end residential pools. This was a project in Southern California, had 3 or 4 big pools and also this kind of lazy river that went around the property that was fully clad in tile. Another example of some luxury resort pools. This was a hotel in the Caribbean that had personal pools at each unit. And they all had this beautiful view of these mountains. So another excellent structure, but a very demanding one. And we'll get into those nuances as we go through this. Some more large scale pools. These are for the military. So we have customers of all types that we've assisted around the world in the country, and even, you know, smaller types of pools, but higher level of detail. So we see a lot of these glass finishes used, and look at the detailing on the nosings and the steps and the curves, if you will, with the details. Involves a lot of high-end craftsmanship. And I'm happy to say that we have a lot of customers that use our products for these applications that are super skilled at what they do. And, you know, our products would be nothing without their skill. So labor is a really key important part of what we do with our products and these features. This is an example of a large water wall. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, completely submerged like a tub or a spa or a pool. But these types of structures face the same demanding types of environmental challenges and installation issues as well. So this is in the Caribbean, in a large scale tiled wall. I think it's like 70 feet high. I can't even remember how long it is, but an enormous project. And this was just a magnificent structure. And then some very subtle ones. This doesn't even look like a tiled pool, right? But it is infinity edge, you know, tough environment, up on a hill, full sun exposure. What are the challenges there? We're going to talk about that a little bit. So it might not look like it's all that much, but again, a very demanding application. Dark tile, exterior, high up on a mountain, full sun exposure. We're going to talk about that. So let's get into the types of pool structures that our industry deals with. So LATICRETE relies heavily on industry standards. So we're going to reference Tile Council of North America, TCNA. We're going to reference ANSI, American National Standards Institute, and what relevant installation materials specifications apply to this type of work. So Tile Council has several details that deal with what we're going to talk about. And there's really 2 types of structures, if you will, cast in place concrete or gunite or shotcrete type place structures. And they both types can fall under P601, P602, or B417. And we're going to review these briefly as we go through it. So the benefits of cast in place concrete, right? Shrinkage control, but you may have to deal with some cold joints. You may have to deal with some surface defects, and there might be a higher level of preparation from the forms, maybe some form release oil that we have to deal with. things of that nature. The Shotcrete type of installation has less shrinkage. It's a monolithic type pour, and we're going to show you some of those. Those are probably the more popular ones now. The cast in place ones are really the larger scale, Olympic size pool, maybe the more institutional type constructs, say for schools, and things of that nature. Maybe even high rise condominiums and apartments might use more of the cast in place, but the one-off type applications are typically going to be the Shotcrete type. So again, here's what we're using: Tile Council and ANSI. If you don't have these manuals, we would strongly encourage that you get them. You can even download them off of the Tile Council of North America's website, and it's really good to have so you can see what standards apply. Other things that influence the installations are building codes, plumbing codes, and there are pool and spa codes. So for instance, here in the US, some of these pool and spa codes even deal with how to protect the pool installation, how to keep it safe from its users, how to change over the water, how many users are going to be using the facility. So there's a lot of information that can influence the performance or the long-term performance of the installation materials. And a lot of that has to do with water chemistry and maintenance of that nature. So if we're in the pool business, we need to have a holistic view of what we're doing. So tile installation standards are just a small part of it. We need to know what the plumbing code might influence our local applications, the building code, and then again, any relevant pool and spa codes. So let's take P601. This is probably one of the most popular methods that's in the handbook. It is probably the oldest method that's in the handbook. This method assumes that the tank is already watertight. Therefore, if you look at the detail on the right-hand side, you'll notice that waterproofing is typically not included. Now, we could put waterproofing in it after the fact as a topical membrane, but in this method, waterproofing doesn't appear because it assumes the tank is tight. And especially if you're using a concrete structure cast in place and it's at least 6 inches thick, that's another element that basically assumes that if it's 6 inches thick, it's already watertight, if you will, and waterproof to a degree. So you won't see waterproofing in there. But in some of the LATICRETE details, we will add it as an optional secondary membrane, just in case, and it also acts as a crack isolation membrane directly under the tile finish. The other cool thing, if you look in the handbook, you'll see different base profiles and different coping profiles, which can be utilized according to what your installation is. And it's not going to be perfect. You're not always going to have this same sort of coping or base detail, but it's enough information to allow you to understand what's involved with this. So here is the thin bed version of P601. So instead of having the thick mortar bed, it's already going on a prepared surface. It's assuming that the concrete is already to the desired level and height, and you're just going to thin set on it. Chances are you're never going to have that be perfect too. So you can include some skimming, some thin mortar bed leveling, if you will, to make sure that the walls and the floors are exactly where you need them to be before you install your tile. But again, P601, both the mud bed version, and you'll see MB for mortar bed or mud bed, and then TB for thin bed, assumes the tank is watertight. Now, if we look at Shotcrete, right, and here's, again, you can also put this into P601 sort of category, and we use these older photos sometimes just to show you how old some of these techniques are. Now, we might have modernized a few things maybe in the delivery system, but Shotcrete and Gunite, you know, has been around a long time. Very effective way to shape and pour pools. So here's a more modern picture, and you know, you don't see much change, right? Again, it's sand cement. There might be some polymers, some tackifiers, and the ready mix material that's coming to the site. But the process is relatively the same. You're framing up the installation, you're shaping it, and then you're blowing in your shotcrete or your gunite to create your shell. So here's a couple of in progress photos, and you can see the level of detail that's needed. You know, you're going to have some surveying that's very important to make sure that you're in plane with your walls, to make sure your stairs are correct. You don't want to have one deeper than the other one. So it requires a lot of preparation and forethought. And here again is a nice finish photo of that type of structure. And the beautiful thing about this is if it receives plaster or even tile, you'll see that it has a nice rough texture, which is always ideal when we're placing ceramic tile finishes and mortar beds. It lowers the preparation level when compared to cast in place structures. So you're not removing foam release agents and oils of that nature. You're just basically washing and allowing it to dry, and you're ready to go. So this is a beautiful structure ready to receive tile and plaster finishes. So that's P601. P602 looks very similar to P601, and it is. The only difference is this method assumes that the tank is not watertight. And I would venture to say that the bulk of the tanks out there are going to be P602. You're always going to have a measure of seepage. You might have some negative hydrostatic pressure, and you might have other defects that are allowing water intrusion, maybe through penetration receptacles and things of that nature. And that's just something to be expected nowadays. Think about this. All the good land is probably taken. So you're going to be dealing with structures that are in low-lying areas, maybe up against some hills and some areas where water is going to cascade through, and you're going to have to deal with moisture. So P602 allows you to understand that. And in this method, you'll see that there's a mandatory cementitious waterproofing membrane required in this method, and that goes on first. That's there to address the tank, to make sure that we don't have seepage or migration into the tank. Now, there's other things you can do too. If you're a pool builder, then you want to really take into consideration a lot of things. You can build hydrostatic relief valves so that if the water table rises to a certain level, it ejects that water before it even comes into contact with the bottom side of the tank. And that might be mandatory or necessary in some of these structures that are in low-lying areas that have migration of water to be a real possibility. So that's the main difference here. P602 assumes the tank is not watertight. You can also put on an optional secondary waterproofing membrane directly under the tile. And that also can function as a crack isolation membrane too. So you could have one right on the bottom, or you could have two. So look at the detail. And again, you'll see the same thing as P601, an optional base detail for a curved cove or a square cove, the coping differences as well. And it's very similar to P601. So how do we address the waterproofing? So LATICRETE has a primary waterproofing that you can use in method P602. It's our Hydroban cementitious waterproofing membrane. So that will go on first. The other option here, and I just want to touch on it briefly, is sometimes there's even a colloidal silicate spray that can be applied to the tank before Hydroban cementitious membrane. And you'll notice in P602 that there is a note there that mentions that you can apply this sprayed on material. And what that does is that hopes to densify the tank as well. So if you are using that, that goes on first. It dries according to the manufacturer's installation instructions. And then the Hydraband cementitious waterproofing membrane follows that. So that's the sequence. The colloidal spray first, and then the Hydraband cementitious. B417, we won't spend a lot of time on. This is a unique one. You'll see all the iterations of it on the right-hand side. So it could be concrete, it could be wood form, it could be a combination of both. I will say this, that if you have a wood form tub or spa or pool, that might be one of the most difficult things to pull off. LATICRETE can assist. We don't see many of them, but they do exist. Some Roman tubs might be created out of this type of build as well. If you need assistance with that, contact LATICRETE, we can help you with it. But this is the other method. B417 is very similar to P601, and then you could have the optional waterproofing membranes that are inserted there too. So how about if you have a partially tiled pool and one that's mainly plaster? So these are probably the most common types of pools. Residential pools are usually not completely tiled. So you'll see in this instance, the tile is just at the water line. It may be at the stairs as a decorative feature or for safety reasons, so you can see the step, so it doesn't just blend into the plaster finish. So for safety reasons, you might have tile on the stairs. You might have racing lanes or racing targets that are tile, and then the rest of the pool is plaster. So how do we deal with these types of installations? From a LATICRETE perspective, we want to make sure that if it is an all tiled pool, you can use LATICRETE Hydraband liquid. If it is a partially tiled pool, we do not recommend Hydraband liquid membrane to be used in this structure. So if you can just keep this kind of rule of thumb in mind, Hydraband liquid is for fully tiled pools only, not for partially tiled pools. If you have a partial tiled pool and you need waterproofing, we would recommend Hydraband cementitious waterproofing membrane because it can resist the effects of the negative seepage and also the positive pressures and stresses that a plaster finish can typically put on a waterproofing membrane. So hopefully that makes sense. LATICRETE has more information on that if you need it, but just remember, partially tiled pools, only Hydraband cementitious waterproofing if waterproofing is required. That's why we wanted to show this slide here. There's also steel structures. And in steel structures, you'll note that it does not have a method that appears in the Tile Council handbook. Despite that, these types of structures are increasing in popularity. We run into these on a weekly basis. They're proven, they're excellent, they're high performance, and they're very effective. And we're going to talk a little bit about these as we go through the presentation too. But a steel structure doesn't have a Tile Council installation method yet for whatever reason. And you'll notice that about Tile Council, you won't see a method for everything, but it doesn't mean that you can't tile them and they don't exist. LATICRETE has had great success with steel structures as well. This is the methodology that we would use. So you basically have a rigid steel substrate. You use an epoxy adhesive. We'll get into a little bit of those types later on. And you use epoxy grout. So the whole system is an epoxy setting system. And that's flexible enough and strong enough and chemically compatible to be able to adhere to that stainless steel substrate. So we have more information on that too if you need assistance with that. This is a thick bed version of the steel structure. I will say this will be the most rarest installation type for steel. Usually it's the direct bond in this method here where you're adhering directly to steel. This one is rare that you would use, and you would only use it if the steel somehow was compromised or if their elevations weren't correct. But we have both versions, but the thin bed version is the most common of the two. This is probably one of the world's most famous steel structure pools. And this is a LATICRETE project. So this project is in Singapore. You may have seen it even in the movies. It's very, very popular. Every time they do an aerial view of the city country of Singapore, you will see the Sands Marina Bay project. And this is the pool that sits on top of those three structures. Now, the critical engineering thing with this project is, as you notice, those three towers can move independently of each other. And there's a highly engineered track system that allows that pool basically to float up there as those three towers move independently of each other while the pool stays basically floating. And you'll actually get waves in that pool depending on how those towers move. That pool was made by a US manufacturer. It was fabricated here and shipped over there in parts and then tiled on site. So many pool manufacturers that are in the steel business will fabricate them in their factories. They can ship them pre-tiled, partially tiled, or just as a blank, and they're tiled in place when they arrive. So that's just a glorious type of pool. So anyway, we can do steel structures as well. So now let's get into the installation system. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we take that tank, however it comes to us as the installation contractor for the tile. It should be clean, free of any surface defects or contaminants. We want to make sure that we can adhere to it. We also want to make sure that it's flat and level. So we're always going to use 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet, if you will, or 6 millimeters and 3 meters as our flatness plane, especially if you're using smaller format materials like glass tile. You'll see every defect if we don't have a very flat and plumb substrate. So we want to repair any of those before we move on. So how do we do this surface preparation? Well, to get the structure clean, we want to make sure that we're removing any contaminants. We could use low pressure water if there's not a lot of contaminant there. We could use high pressure water blast if we're removing existing, say, paints or coatings, form release oils. Sometimes we may have to resort to other mechanical means of bead blasting or shot blasting. But the key here is we don't want to use acidic washing methods. The acid does not like cementitious surface. That's why you're using it to clean off cement laetants and other contaminants. But guess what? The installation materials are also cement-based. And that acid is never neutralized completely, and it can have a deleterious effect on the installation materials, because as soon as it gets wet again, it will reactivate and it aggressively attacks the cementitious materials. So our experience has been is don't use acid, use high pressure or low pressure wash or some other sort of mechanical means. And here you see evidence of this high pressure wash, and you can see the worker here, he's actually removing that colored top coat of plaster and getting down to a surface that can either be replastered or retiled. And that's what we're really looking for at that point. So once we're all clean and we're ready to go, this is the sequence, right? So remember we talked about that colloidal silicate spray. So if that has to be used, and you'll see it in specifications, that is applied first, right? So you see the laborer here with that spray, it's a liquid. It goes on very fine. It's fogged on. It goes onto the tank, and it's allowed to harden and dry. Once that happens, then you can come back with the Hydraband cementitious waterproofing membrane if you're in the P602 installation sequence. So that's how it goes first. Colloidal spray, if specified. Hydraband cementitious waterproofing membrane, if specified, right, according to P602. So this is how the product goes down. It's a water mixed only material. It's highly polymer fortified. If you mix this it'll stick to everything. Super, super tacky. And it's mixed to like a wet, super soupy, like oatmeal-y type texture. And it can be applied with a trowel. It can be applied with a brush. And most applications, it's applied with a heavy nap paint roller. And so you'll trowel it on, you'll roll it on, and you'll see it just gets into all the nooks and crannies of everything, and it puts on a nice coating. So sometimes you may have to hit it twice if you have, you know, a few little areas that might be thin. You use a wet gauge, mill thickness gauge, to make sure that you put on the right amount of waterproofing, and that way you have a consistent coating of this material. So again, this is going on first onto the tank. Here's a great example of a low-lying area tank. It is literally yards away from the beach. So look at how damp that tank is, right? So there had seepage, obviously. It was not completely watertight. So they pumped out the water and they were able to apply the cementitious Hydroban first to make sure that there's no intrusion of moisture into the tank. Once we have that in place and we're fully dry, then you can start your leveling process. So we recommend using our polymer fortified materials. LATICRETE 3701 fortified mortar bed is a high strength polymer fortified screed and rendering material, and you can use it for walls and floors. It could be mixed to a plaster type consistency for thinner areas and for vertical work. And it can also be mixed to a dry pack screed consistency for horizontal floor work. And if you're doing horizontal work, then you're going to need to have a slurry bond coat applied to the concrete or to the Hydroban cementitious waterproofing layer in order for the screed, which is drier, to be able to bond to that. So the platinum is mixed to a very wet, soupy type consistency, and it's used as a bond coat. So here's an example of these materials being used. So you'll see them, they could be used horizontally in a very thin layer. So we have a bond coat applied, and then the screed is placed on top. Vertically, you don't typically need to have a bond coat because the material is mixed to a wetter consistency, and there's enough latex, Portland cement, liquid paste to wet out the surface. And then you can do all your leveling work. The picture on the upper left hand here, you'll see all that leveling and shaping work that's required. That's done with these products. And you can get to a nice, smooth, level, or pitched, for that matter, whatever heights or levels you need. So these are the screeding products that you would use. So if we think about, you know, waterproofing, right? So say we're in this process now, but we just want to make sure that we have complete protection. You can use the optional secondary membrane as depicted in those tile council methods. So, you know, what is the difference between watertight, water resistant, waterproof? You'll hear all these phrases, right? You could be watertight or water resistant, but not necessarily waterproof, right? So if you want ultimate protection, you might want to consider putting a secondary membrane over the top of your leveling beds before you tile. So they're liquid applied materials. Those are the types that we would recommend over the top, if you will. They're bonding right to the substrate, and they're very simple to apply. So in the photo on the right here, you're seeing a picture of LATICRETE 9235 liquid applied waterproofing membrane. That was one of our first liquid applied membrane products. It has a reinforcing fabric with it. We have other iterations of that type of technology available now, but that's what we will be talking about for a secondary. So those membranes are not good for hydrostatic pressure. So we would not put that on a tank that has high moisture issues, seepage. If you recall the picture that we showed, with that little tank near the ocean, these membranes are not good for that, right? We want to waterproof them with other types of materials, which could even include the cementitious hydroban as we talked about. But in some cases, you might even have to have another type of waterproofing in the structure, right? So to protect the structure below. So like on elevated tanks, maybe sitting on top of a high rise, or within a condominium complex. If you're relying on an ANSI 11810 thin membrane to protect your building, that may not be the best course of action, right? So there's other membranes that are suitable depending on the structure. So that's kind of what we're trying to highlight here. Make sure that we have the appropriate waterproofing for the application. These ANSI 11810 membranes that are placed directly under the tile also serve as crack isolation. Many of them can handle up to 1/8 of an inch in plane movement, right? So that means open and close. You can't have vertical displacement. So that could protect the tile, from thermal expansion, from shock, and things of that nature, maybe freeze thaw. So these crack isolation features, if you will, of these membranes are very ideal. Okay, so put this up here just to give you an idea of, again, what can happen when you're putting membrane on, right? So here's a classic installation of LATICRETE 9235 waterproofing membrane. And just think about some of the things that could be some challenges here, right? It's hot because one of the workers has his shirt off, right? So he's working in direct sunlight outside. So you have to worry about flashing off, right? Also, if you look at the areas that were already installed, they don't look like they were protected really well, right? You got footprints everywhere. You might have had construction. It looks like they were cutting lumber, some other areas. So we put this up just so you can start to think about the overall process, right? So we may want to protect this installation from the elements as we're working. So maybe some tenting and shading might be in order. We'll show you some slides as we go through our presentation. And even after the membrane is in place, we have to really protect it from other trades, because that sort of contamination can lead to some bonding issues. So just start to think about what you would do when you're faced with the construction sequence and how you can protect everything. So here's the difference between some of our liquid applied membranes. We talked about 9235. That's our flagship product that was introduced first way back in the day. It has a reinforcing fabric that goes with it. Today we have Hydroban, which is our current flagship product. Basically does everything 9235 does, but it doesn't have the reinforcing fabric, and you can flood test quicker. So Hydroban also serves as a dual function crack isolation and waterproofing material, and you can flood test in as little as 2 hours after the membrane cures. Here's an example of a full pool flood test on the second floor over retail space. So this could be time consuming, but if you have a critical application, you may want to think about flood testing. And sometimes you're flood testing an entire pool to make sure that it doesn't leak. So this is an example of that. Okay, so we have primary waterproofing membrane, we have leveling, we have optional secondary membrane. Now we're ready to tile, but we want to talk about the tile a little bit. What kind of tile are we using for the application? So there's many types of tiles, right? So there's impervious, there's semi-vitreous, there's glass, there's all sorts of finishes. There's mosaics, which are very popular, and those are mounted in different ways too. So we want to make sure that the tile we're using is suitable. So never would we want to use paper back-mounted materials, right? And even if we're using rear dot-mounted materials, take a look at the dots, make sure that they're not covering the majority of the back of the tile, right? We want to make sure that the tile is suitable for the application. So just think about the mounting first. You may also want to take some mesh mounted materials and do a little test just to make sure that that tile can be used in submerged applications such as this photo depicts. Glass mosaics are covered under ANSI A137.2. There is a little test method in there that also allows that tile to be determined if it can be used in submerged applications. And basically it has to pass a submerged and dry test. There's also freeze thaw testing, and that will indicate whether that tile can be used in a pool. Sometimes you just can't go to your local shop or local home center and buy mosaics, mesh mounted mosaics, and think they're good for pools, because not all mosaics are intended to be used there. So make sure you consult with the tile manufacturer, one, that their glass is suitable, and two, that the mounting that's present with that glass is also suitable. You also have very different installation techniques when using glass, right? They use what's called this knockdown treatment, right? So you burn your thin set mortar into the substrate with the flat side of the trowel, you come back with the notch side, and then you knock those ridges down. And this is especially important if you have a tile that has a measure of transparency, right? Because you don't want to see the trowel ridges behind it or any voids or bug holes. The phrase that's used is ghosting. You don't want to see that behind the glass. So you want to make sure you have complete coverage, especially with transparent or translucent or semi-translucent glass finishes. How about stone? Stone can be tricky in pools. I put this up here because this is probably one of the most iconic stone pools in the world. This is Hearst Castle out in California, and this is green Vermont marble and Carrara. Simply magnificent pool structure. It was rebuilt recently. All the stone was removed and new stone was cut to match the existing patterns. Just a marvelous installation, but this stone was very thick. And the thicker the stone, the less subjected it is to damage, right? Porosity, stability, and things of that nature. The point of this is not all stone is good for pools too. You want to make sure that your homework is done before we put stone in a pool, because stone can be very dynamic. There's very specific issues that stone may not be suitable for that. So just do your homework if stone is being selected. This is the interior pool of that same project, just a magnificent glass structure. So we just put that up there just so you can get an idea of what you can do with tile. Just magnificent. So what kind of adhesives would we use for these applications? Well, there's two types. There's latex Portland cement mortars, and there's epoxy adhesives. Never would we want to use unmodified products or dry set materials. We want to use at least the latex modified products. Here's another example of what you could run into, and just think about what you're doing, right? So another installation, bright sunshine, dark membrane. How hot do you think that membrane is? And just think about that when you're troweling on latex thin set mortar and how quickly it might set off, right? So just think about your conditions and working environments, but this is the sequence of what you would be facing. So maybe some tenting or shading might have been in order here, right? Just be cognizant of your environment. So the types of installation materials that are available out there, you have the Generation 1 installation materials, the 2-component products, right? A liquid and a powder. They typically fell under ANSI 118.4. And we still have those products. And in some instances, they're still used. But more commonly, you're going to see the 1-component water mixed products that meet an even higher performance standard of ANSI A118.15, or its ISO, I don't want to say equivalent, but its ISO designation of C2TES1. And these examples of LATICRETE products, either platinum, titanium, Multi-Max Light, our glass tile adhesive are examples of that. And then you also have the epoxy adhesive for challenging applications and when tiling over steel structures. So here's an example of that product as well. You can also make a tinted adhesive if you want to make an adhesive that's the same color as the grout, especially if you're working with thin glass mosaics and you know what a challenge that is when the adhesive bleeds through. So you can tint, say, our platinum with one of our PERMACOLOR Select Grout color kits and make a tinted adhesive that would match the grout color. Still a two-step process, but it's not going to drive you crazy to have all those bleeders of thin set mortar coming through the glass and then having your finisher be mad at you for weeks and months on end because you didn't clean the grout joints out correctly. So that's just a little trick or a hack to get around on that. And then our LATIPOXY 300 would be our epoxy adhesive that we would recommend for those demanding applications. It meets ANSI 118.3. Its ISO counterpart is R2, and that's the specification that you will see. So let's just talk about coverage real quick. The illustration in the center, the lower center, illustrates that the larger your tile gets, the more difficult it is to achieve your coverage, right? So think about that, and that makes sense, right? The larger the tile, the harder it is to get the complete coverage. ANSI recommends at least 95% continuous coverage. If you're using transparent or translucent glass, it should be 100%. So how do you make sure that you're getting that, right? So use the right size notch trowel, verify your coverage, lift the tile periodically, make sure you're getting the right coverage, tap and beat in your tiles. So if they're smaller materials, maybe a rubber grout float is suitable. Maybe a beating block with a rubber mallet might be suitable, or maybe a rubber mallet that's non-staining for larger formats might be suitable. So the point here is whatever method you're using to embed your tile, you want to hit your coverage target. Okay, so that's a lot so far. Our tile is in place now. Now we're ready to grout. And by the way, this is one of those steel tanks that we showed before. You can't even tell it's a steel tank. It looks like a cast in place concrete structure. That's how cool and how good these steel tanks are too. So same thing as we talked about adhesives. We have cement materials and epoxy materials. Cement materials are always going to be easier, but they also have the most challenges with water chemistry resistance, potential erosion, and things of that nature, right? So we make our grouts, our cement grouts, to be as resistant to what a pool will face, but they're not going to be perfect, right? You're always going to have some sort of issue with cement grouts, especially if your water is not maintained. Epoxy grouts, on the other hand, have a lower porosity rate. They're less resistant to deterioration. They're less or more resistant to water imbalance, pH imbalance, total alkalinity variances. They remain more color fast, and they have a much lower absorption rate. So if you were to ask us what grout would we prefer, we would always tell you, when possible, use an epoxy grout. It's always going to perform better in these environments. And think about this. These environments could be highly corrosive. You know, with your chemicals, the environment, the load of people that might be in there, you never know what's going to be in that pool. So using the most resistant grout out there is always going to be the best choice. And we recommend Spectral.OCK Pro Premium Grout for those instances. If you're going to use cement grout, we would suggest either PERMACOLOR or PERMACOLOR Select as our cement grout options. We also want to make sure that we put movement joints in a pool or any tiled structure for that matter. Tile Council gives us information reference EJ 171 for more details on that. Here's a good example of a pool, and you can start to think, where am I going to put the movement joints? Well, Tile Council recommends changes of plane, corners, coves, and then every 8 to 12 feet in each direction. So if you're looking at this, and even against restraining surfaces, if you're looking at this, where would I put them, right? So here's an example of where you could put them, right? Just an illustrative view of that. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to cut movement joints all the way down through the mortar bed, down into the we're not saying that. That's up to the structural engineer. We're saying at least in the tile layer and maybe in the leveling layer when necessary, right? But at least in the tile layer, you need these sort of movement joints. And never do you want to tile over an existing movement joint as we see here. Here's a movement joint in an Olympic pool. It goes right down the center. You cannot tile over that. It is a disaster waiting to happen, right? So be cognizant of the type of joint that you have. This is an illustration of what can happen with movement. So you see the right side wall here, and it looks like there's a belly in the tile, right? Well, there were no movement joints here. And just a little bit of movement can tent and force the tile loose. And notice that movement there of how much damage or loss of bond occurred just because there wasn't a vertical movement joint there to accommodate that. And that's why Tile Council recommends that. I'm going to go through this real quick. Be cognizant of penetrations with waterproofing, how you treat them. LATICRETE can help. Usually you have to use a combination of waterproofing and silicone sealant like our LATICIL, which is 100% silicone, to marry the membrane to the fixture if there isn't a bonding receptacle. So most drains, lights, ladder stanchions, other sort of penetrations might not have a clamp to receive the membrane, if you will. So the best thing you could do is run your membrane up against it and then use a bead of silicone at the membrane layer and then also at the tile layer. So you may have 2 beads of sealant when you're waterproofing or trying to make solid these penetrations. So here's a window, you could have pipes, all sorts of penetrations. Let's just talk about weather protection again. Remember those photos we showed of those crews working in direct sunlight, dark membrane, hot summer day, all sorts of things, maybe wind, maybe rain. Sometimes you might have to consider tenting. And I know that in Southern California, we tent all the time to make sure that we can get the installations in. Sometimes we even have to climate control the areas, right? So obviously that's not going to be practical in every application. Here's one that has climate control. Again, it's in Southern California. Probably the daytime temperature is 105 degrees. Most of the working temperatures on our products max out at 90. How do you make sure that you can conform, right? So sometimes tenting, cooling, sometimes even heating in our environments here. You know, we've had to recommend that, or sometimes the project engineers will do that, where they're pumping heat into a structure. And here's a pool that has heat pumped into it during the winter months so that they can execute the installation accordingly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to let you know that if you need information on pool maintenance and water chemistry, LATICRETE has documents that they can provide to you that can help. You can submit them as part of your leave behind, if you will, after your work is done. So the owner and the general contractor can have an idea of how to maintain those structures. One thing that's really important too is when you're filling a pool or draining a pool, LATICRETE has a recommended 1 inch per hour max. And that's very important to allow the system to acclimate to the exposure of the water, to the weight, to the temperature. It's a harsh dynamic change. And if you fill too fast, and even more importantly, if you drain too fast, you can stress that installation to a point where you can get buckling, heaving, and things of that nature. So make sure you acclimate correctly, 1 inch per hour on fill and drain rates. We talked about epoxy grouts before. If we can leave you with that too, whenever possible, use epoxy grout. I can't tell you how many times we see this, and you'll see it yourself. You go to a hotel pool, a resort pool, and you look at the tile, and there's no grout in the joints. It's just tile, thin set, and tile, right? Especially in public pools, they are subjected to calcium depletion when the water is not maintained. So think about a public pool. One day I could have 5 people. The next day I could have 50 people. I could have a sunny day. I could have a cloudy, rainy day. And the poor guy trying to balance the water is fighting all that. And he's usually not going to be correct all the time. And that's going to affect the cement grout. So again, another tip, if we could leave you with this, is use epoxy grout whenever possible. And then LATICRETE offers a full complement of information available to you on our website. LATICRETE tech service team put together a technical design manual on pools. It's an over 200-page document that talks about anything you can talk about with tiled pools. And we've recently updated. It's available for download free of charge. Go to our website, read it. It's great information, anything you need to know about tiled pools. So that's basically it. I'm happy that we had you join us today. At this point in time, I think we have like 5 minutes left or so. I don't know if any questions came through.
Hey, Art, thank you so much for this presentation. First of all, that was a lot of information, and it was a lot of really good information. We actually don't have any questions. So I'm going to say that's because you've done such a good job at explaining everything. But if anybody has any questions, I would encourage you to raise your hand, and we can answer some of these questions live. So if anybody has anything, please let us know now. Oh, we've got Chris Connell that raised his hand. Chris, I'm going to allow you to talk, and you can speak live and ask your questions. Go ahead, Chris. You can
Good
unmute.
afternoon. Thank you again for doing this presentations for us. It was very informative. Mike, I have a couple questions, but the most important, when you guys sell this product to an installer, do you guys make sure that these people are certified in the use of your product, or can anybody buy your product and install it?
How you doing, Chris? Thank you for that question. Really good question, by the way. So I will say this, LATICRETE is a big proponent of training. LATICRETE endorses certified labor. We encourage all labor to have a great understanding of what they're doing. Unfortunately, we can't control everything, right, Chris? So we can't be out there saying, no, you can't use our product, you didn't do this and that. It's impossible for us to do that. I just will say that we do encourage it, and especially in demanding applications such as pools, and there are other ones that are very demanding, we would always encourage them to at least contact our rep, learn about our products. We have a lot of training modules as well from the tech service perspective, and we would strongly encourage that, but we do promote and encourage certified labor.
Okay, now in keeping with that, what if somebody is, say, using your product, 2 different elements of your product, but then combining it with their own fortified mortar from a different company, and then even still a crystalline membrane on the concrete underneath the mortar? How do you guys address situations where your product is not being actually applied in the way that you guys want it to be applied?
All right, so that's a great question too. So first off, it could impact the warranty, right? LATICRETE provides extended systems warranties when the full complement of our products are used together. So right, we'll always encourage that. But you're right, Chris. At times, there's other elements that are outside of the LATICRETE product portfolio. We would take those on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes there might be products that LATICRETE simply doesn't manufacture, but are necessary for an application. We would certainly consider that and not exclude them from use if necessary. Site mix materials, again, they've been in use for thousands of years. Can they be successful? Absolutely, when they're done correctly. However, that may impact the LATICRETE warranty as to what we can provide, because you're not purchasing a LATICRETE product, so we wouldn't be able to warrant that per se. But could they be effective? Of course they could. And LATICRETE could provide guidance on that if that's necessary too.
Excellent. That definitely helps for those installations. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for attending and for those questions.
Absolutely. Doesn't look like we have any other questions. We have about a minute left here. Oh, we have one more. Dominic, I'm going to unmute you or allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, doesn't seem like I'm not able to unmute you, Dominic, so you have to unmute yourself. There you go. Dominic, we can't hear you, sir. Hello. Oh, it seems we're having some. Dominic? Oh, I thought we had you for a second there, but you're gone again. Dominic, it doesn't seem like we have a good connection here. We can't hear you, sir.
We can take his question later too via email too.
Yeah, Dominic, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact Richard and he can get in touch with us. Otherwise, you can feel free to call our technical service hotline. You can also reach us by email or chat. So if you go to our website, you'll have all that information available and you can find all the ways with which you can reach us. But it doesn't appear as though we can hear you currently, so I'll apologize for that. Any other questions? Oh, Chris McConnell.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, sir.
Yep, I just walked into Dominic's office to get his question.
Oh. Awesome.
So can the epoxy be applied directly over the tile? Is it possible to get the copy of this presentation today?
So yes, you certainly can get a copy of the presentation. Again, we can provide that. It's a big file.
Sorry, the epoxy over the hydroban.
Okay. So as far as the presentation, we can certainly provide it to you. It's a large file. We may have to send it to you via Dropbox or box.
Yep, I can accommodate that.
Okay. So as far as epoxy over hydroban, yes, hydroban and LATIPOXY 300 are completely compatible. Just be cognizant of cure times, right? So let the hydroban cure out completely, and then it can be applied. So it depends on the type of tile finish. You also have to check with the tile manufacturer. For example, some glass mosaic manufacturers don't want epoxy, right? And you can think the reason why, especially if it's a transparent material and then it's over membrane, right? You're entrapping a lot of things there. So check with all those elements, but certainly LATIPOXY 300 is compatible with hydroban.
Now, is that an acceptable use with a partially tiled pool? Like if we had just a waterline tiled, the hydroban liquid and then an epoxy?
No, that is not acceptable. So remember, we talked about that during the presentation, right? In those instances where it's a partially tiled pool, the only membrane LATICRETE would recommend in that would be LATICRETE Hydroban Cementitious waterproofing. So hydroban liquid, here's the rule of thumb, it's all or nothing, right? It's either all tiled and you can use it, or not at all. You cannot use it in partially tiled installations.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome, Chris. Thank you, Dominic. Sorry we couldn't hear you.
All right, so we're a little bit past our time. Chris, are you all done here? I see your hand is still raised. I'm going to unraise it. Anybody else has any other question before we close this out? Okay, I will take the silence as a no. So guys, thank you so very much for participating. I know it's tough, especially on a Friday afternoon. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of the day before your weekend to join us on this webinar. Art, thank you so very much. Always wonderful to hear you, sir. And this presentation is being recorded, so I will send the link to Richard Gluntz. So if you would like to play this presentation again, please contact Richie and he will have the link for you. Otherwise, we will also make the PowerPoint available to you all as well. So thank you again very much. I wish you all a great afternoon and a fantastic weekend. Take
Thank
care,
you,
guys.
everybody. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Gilles.
Thank you, Art. Bye-bye.